I'm Ivy Wallace, 35 years old. Right now I'm standing in the oak-paneled library of the Chandler Estate, a stately mansion perched on a hill west of Portland, Oregon. Every wall here breathes memories. Every window frame recalls a time I longed to belong to, and just as fiercely, tried to escape from. To them, I've always been the poor orphan niece with a modest lifestyle. To me, they've always been the clearest definition of vanity, wrapped in silk and studded with diamonds. The Chandler family is well known throughout the Pacific Northwest for its long-standing real estate holdings, dating back to the 1930s. My great-grandfather, George Chandler, started with a small wooden home in Boise and built what would become Chandler Realty Group. When my grandmother Eleanor took over, then the only woman among a sea of gray-suited men, the company already owned nearly 40 residential and commercial properties across Oregon and Washington. But my father chose a different path. As Eleanor's youngest son, he left Portland after college and moved to Bend to open a small architecture office. There, he met my mother, a nature-loving elementary school teacher who preferred wildflowers over jewelry. When they got married, my grandmother didn't attend. Her reason? Someone who knows nothing about finance can't be a Chandler daughter-in-law. Still, they lived happily for 12 years in a modest wooden house, with a vegetable garden out back and creaky floorboards that echoed every time I ran through them. My parents weren't wealthy, but they gave me something no one in the Chandler family ever taught: independence. When I was 14, my mother used to say, "Money is a tool, not a goal. If you let it define your worth, you'll live in fear forever." I didn't understand then what she was preparing me for, but I do now. At 16, a weekend getaway ended with a call from the state police. My parents had died in a car crash on Highway 97. There were no survivors. My world collapsed that September afternoon when the police knocked on our door, papers in hand. The person who signed to take me in was the very woman who once turned her back on her son for loving a schoolteacher without a pedigree. Eleanor Chandler. She didn't hug me when I arrived. No one in that house did. But she led me to the library, pointed at shelves lined with real estate files and market charts, and said, "If you're smart enough to survive this, you'll learn that money isn't for show. It's for control." I didn't cry. I sat down, pulled out a leather notebook, and began writing down every term she mentioned: equity, amortization, cap rate. Over the next 3 years, while my cousins learned how to burn money on parties and sports cars, I learned to read balance sheets as if they were a second language. And I learned from the best. Every night, Eleanor sat for hours in her study, her brass desk lamp casting a soft yellow glow across the face that once commanded respect from an entire generation of real estate brokers. She never told me she loved me. But she taught me everything. How to spot an undervalued property. How to decode tax filings to uncover hidden potential. How to stay quiet at the right moment. And strike when your opponent lets their guard down. For those 3 years I became Eleanor's only student, and the last person she ever added to her will. But the Chandlers never forgave her for that. I know. Because after her death, I slipped right back into the same role in their eyes. A nameless girl, clinging to memories and their leftover pity. They started calling me Poor Ivy right after Grandma Eleanor passed, the same year I graduated from college. Of course, no one ever said it to my face, but I didn't need to hear it. One glance from them said it all. At every holiday dinner, I was the only one without a Gucci purse or Cartier bracelet. I sat at the far end of the table, listening to stories about yacht parties in Newport and winter homes in Jackson Hole, while all I had were night shifts at the investment bank and the small single-family homes I quietly bought, fixed up, and rented out. No one asked me what I did. No one really cared. I still remember Christmas when I was 27. The party was at Uncle Lawrence's lakefront estate. Eleanor's younger brother. The place was like a resort. Marble floors, Italian chandeliers, a fireplace bigger than my entire bedroom. I showed up in a camel wool coat, scuffed leather boots, and a $25 bottle of red from a local wine shop. Charlotte, Uncle's eldest daughter, spotted me the moment I stepped in. She wore a Roland Mouret red dress, and held her champagne like she was born doing it. "Oh, Ivy," Charlotte sang, dragging the last syllable like calling a pet. "Still in that little apartment in the Mission? I thought you'd have moved up by now. Seems a bit cramped for a grown woman, doesn't it?" I smiled without answering. To the Chandlers, success had to smell like expensive perfume and echo in the click of heels on stone tile. They had no idea that within 3 years of Grandma's passing, I had title to 4 duplexes, all under an LLC no one in the family recognized. W. Willow Properties. They had no idea I had a steady stream of income, enough that I never had to ask for anything. But that didn't matter. I didn't need them to know. I just needed them to not see I was preparing. Step by step. For the perfect reveal. At 30, something happened that shifted everything. The family held a strategic discussion, their name for the annual meeting, to decide who would handle what in the Chandler Realty empire. I arrived 10 minutes late, stuck in traffic from a remodel site in Northeast Portland. The long conference table was covered in zoning maps, profit charts, and glossy photos of luxury projects they were chasing. I slid into a seat near the end, met by cold, polite nods. Uncle Lawrence looked over his gold-rimmed glasses. "Ivy, do you have anything to present?" I laid a thin folder on the table. Inside were cash flow statements from 3 rentals, plus an investment plan in the Lentz neighborhood, an area quietly rising with infrastructure investment. Charlotte skimmed it and shrugged. "Still flipping those old houses? I figured you'd have moved on to upscale condos by now." I stayed silent. If there's one thing Eleanor taught me, it's this. The louder someone talks, the emptier they usually are. After the meeting, while they drank wine by the lake and took group photos, I stood alone by the lavender hedge. Ethan, Lawrence's son, newly appointed executive VP, came up beside me. "You should sell a few," he said, eyes on his phone. "The market's peaking. You're missing bigger plays holding on to those." I smiled. "Or maybe you should buy more, before I pick up the rest of that zip code." He looked up, brow furrowed. "What?" "Nothing." I turned and walked away, leaving him pale among the lavender. For the next 3 years, I stayed quiet. No social media, no reunions, no galas. I lived in a rented second-floor unit near the elementary school where Mom once taught. But every month, W. Willow's balance grew. I funneled rental income into flips, reinvested into underpriced land, negotiated with banks, talked to contractors. Most of all, I learned to thrive without anyone's approval. The family stayed the same. They kept calling me the poor one of the family, a joke that aged but never died. I once overheard Ethan at a party. "We've got this cousin who lives like she's in a low-budget indie film, tiny place, beat-up car, still shows up to family stuff every year." They laughed, and I stayed quiet. When I got the email from Ethan titled "Family Meeting Agenda, March," a chill ran down my spine like a cold wind across my back. The meeting was set for Saturday at the Chandler Hillside Estate, a 3-story gray stone house perched atop Forest Park. It was also the place where I had lived with Grandma Eleanor during her final years. I knew that whenever the family chose to meet at the estate, it meant something big. And my instincts were never wrong. That morning, Portland was shrouded in thick fog like a velvet curtain. I drove my old Subaru up the hill, the tires softly crunching on the cobblestone path into the estate grounds. Over a dozen luxury cars were already parked: Range Rovers, Teslas, Audis, Mercedes. My car, as always, looked like a blot of ink on white paper. Charlotte answered the door. She wore a caramel-colored tweed suit, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, and smiled as if I had interrupted her spa session. "I thought you weren't coming," she said, kissing my cheek and turning away without waiting for a response. The living room had been cleared. A long walnut conference table stood in the center, each seat marked with a name tag. I had been placed at the far end, right next to the glass doors overlooking the garden. Ethan sat to the right of Uncle Lawrence, now chairman of Chandler Realty Holdings. Ever since Grandma Eleanor passed, no one mentioned her. No flowers, no photos. Just papers, contracts, and profit charts. The meeting began with Uncle Lawrence's opening remarks. His voice was always low, smooth and polished, like marble. As you all know, Chandler Realty is entering a strategic growth phase. After reviewing our entire property portfolio, we've identified one asset currently being underutilized: the Chandler Hillside Estate. My heart clenched. I had prepared for this, but hearing it out loud still made my throat tighten. We've been in talks with Arkland Development. They've expressed interest in turning this location into a luxury apartment complex with 22 units, an infinity pool, and a boutique retail plaza. Projected post-completion value could exceed $40 million. The room buzzed. Charlotte beamed like she had just gotten engaged. Brad, her youngest son, tapped his pen excitedly. "Wait," I said, rising to my feet, my hands trembling slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. "Selling the estate? That's not what Grandma Eleanor ever wanted." Ethan shook his head with a half-smile. "Ivy, she passed almost 8 years ago. Times have changed. This land is wasting its potential just sitting here." "This is a legacy," I said, locking eyes with Lawrence. "It's not just a property. It's a home." "Emotion gets in the way of financial efficiency," he said flatly. "We cannot hold on to a 3-story building for the sake of nostalgia." She told me clearly. She wanted this place to remain the heart of the Chandler family, not be demolished for a row of mirrored metal boxes. Charlotte laughed. "Ivy, are you still clinging to those fairy tale notes? The adults are talking about real assets. You don't really have a seat at this table." I looked down at the voting rights chart. I held just 2%, the portion I inherited from Grandma Eleanor. Lawrence held 38%. Ethan and Charlotte each had 20%, the rest scattered among other cousins and siblings. I was being sidelined, like a pawn on a board filled with rooks and bishops. After the meeting, while everyone toasted to a bold new chapter, I quietly stepped out onto the back patio. The window frames were still the same from when Grandma was alive. I touched the wooden trim. Cracked like spiderwebs, but solid. I remembered the winter nights we spent here by the fireplace. Her teaching me how to read zoning maps and analyze ROI without focusing on instant numbers. "Real value lies in potential tied to memory," she once said. "Never let anyone call your home a commodity." They wanted to sell it all. The roof, the history, the memories. For a flashy rental complex, for strangers. I looked out at the backyard. Spring was coming. The azaleas she planted long ago had begun to bloom, pale purple. And I knew. I was not going to let them destroy it. Not this time, not in the hands of people who never understood the meaning of preservation. That evening, after the meeting ended, the whole family gathered in the grand dining room for dinner, a yearly ritual. The meal was as lavish as ever: prime beef, Napa Valley wine, swan-folded napkins, and an air thick with class superiority. I sat at the far end of the table, directly across from the baccarat chandelier, dangling like a crystal trap. I had just cut into my steak when I heard Charlotte chuckling. "Are you still driving that silver Toyota, Ivy?" I looked up, keeping my expression neutral. "Still runs fine," I said, intentionally leaving it at that. "Red," Charlotte's son, chimed in. "What year is that, 2010? You know you can lease a BMW for just over $600 a month, right?" Laughter rippled through the table. Ethan sipped his wine casually, eyes never leaving me. "I heard," Charlotte continued, her voice dropping like she was sharing a secret. "You're still living in River Point, right? That place just got reported for rats in the public dumpster area." I set down my knife and fork. "You know, I said calmly. Sometimes living simply saves a lot of trouble. Sure, Brad mumbled, as long as you don't mind neighbors throwing balcony parties with Walmart Bluetooth speakers. Ethan nodded and set down his glass, as if to shift the conversation. But instead of easing the tension, he poured gasoline on the fire. Speaking of which, the management company at the apartment complex we're renting just emailed about utility increases and some massive HVAC system overhaul. No notice. Just decided it. Charlotte rolled her eyes. Exactly. Every morning I'm woken up by the drilling at 6:30, and my unit is a premium one. Rent isn't cheap. Brad added. Actually, Dad had someone look into who owns that place now. Apparently it's some holding company based in Delaware. Name sounds like they pulled it from a Scrabble bag, Clearpoint, or Crossview or something. I kept my face still, but my hands clenched under the table. Seems like they're trying to stay anonymous, Ethan said with a hint of mockery. But it's no big deal. We've got friends on the city council. A little pressure can make the owner show their face. I looked at each of them one by one, feeling something inside me crack. They were plotting legal harassment, inserting people into inspection boards to force the anonymous owner to sell the building. What they didn't know was, I was the one they planned to pressure. Riverpoint Heights, the building where Brad, Charlotte and 2 other relatives rented penthouses, belonged to W. Willow Holdings, the company I founded 3 years ago. I'd bought it from a retiring developer, renovated it floor by floor, and increased its value by over 20% in 12 months. And naturally, everything was structured through 3 layers of anonymous entities. I smirked. So what kind of pressure are you thinking, Ethan? Anonymous complaints to zoning, fire safety inspections at 3 a.m.? Ethan glanced at me. What would you know about real estate? I set down my glass. I know that if someone understood the market, they wouldn't try to strong-arm a profitable asset just because they're annoyed by a power drill. Brad burst out laughing. You think you're qualified to talk about this? You don't even have a deed in your name. A cold cut. I said nothing more. But inside a decision was forming, sharp and clear as the chandelier light shining down on Brad's smug face. That night, I left dinner early, citing a headache from the weather. Truthfully, my mind was burning in a different way. Every nerve stretched tight like piano wire. I locked my room on the 2nd floor of the Chandler Hillside estate, opened my laptop, and started a video call with Raymond Clark, the personal attorney I had quietly worked with for the past 7 years. Raymond was the only person besides Mrs. Eleanor who knew exactly what I had done with my initial inheritance. "What's going on, Ivy?" Raymond asked, adjusting his glasses. Behind him was a wall of file shelves, and I knew at least 3 binders had my name on them. "We need to move into the final phase," I said firmly. "I want the full portfolio disclosed, and I want to activate the trust." Raymond nodded like he'd been expecting it. "I'll send the summary. But, are you sure? Once this goes public, there's no going back into the shadows." "I'm not going back," I replied, my eyes landing on the W. Willow Holdings icon at the top right corner of my screen. I've had enough. By 2 a.m., the whole house was quiet. Everyone knocked out by too much wine and empty toast. I sat alone by the window, moonlight spilling across the documents Raymond had just sent me. A breakdown of my current assets. 14 residential properties in Portland, Seattle, and Eugene. 3 commercial buildings, including a fully leased medical center. 1 complex, Riverpoint Heights, where no fewer than 4 Chandler family members currently rent penthouses. Estimated total net worth, $78.5 million. All held through 4 subsidiaries, each legally owned by Chandler Legacy Holdings, a company I formed with no registered owner listed on public records. And now, I was preparing to transfer all of it into the Eleanor Foundation Trust, the charitable foundation I created to protect the true values of the Chandler legacy. Raymond had completed the filings, all I had to do was sign. The next morning, during the family meeting in the grand living room, Uncle Lawrence had just reintroduced the plan to sell the estate, when I stood quietly opened my document case, and pulled out a single folder. Notice of supplemental share acquisition and veto rights in Chandler Realty Holdings. Before you sign anything to sell this estate, I said, I'd like to provide a quick update. Everyone turned to face me. Ethan frowned. Charlotte rolled her eyes. Last night, I completed the transfer of my entire asset portfolio into the Eleanor Foundation Trust. Through it, I now hold an additional 30% ownership in Chandler Realty Holdings, acquired silently over the past 3 years, by buying out small shareholders who'd exited. I walked to the center table and handed the file to Raymond, who had just entered from the side door, timed like a Hollywood cue. This brings my current total to 35% of voting power. Silence froze the entire room. Ethan's mouth dropped. Charlotte spilled her orange juice onto the carpet. What? Brad whispered. She just said what? I continued. With 35%, I have the authority to block any major decision, including the sale of any Chandler Realty asset, especially this Chandler Hillside estate. Uncle Lawrence shot to his feet, face red. This is abuse of power. You can't just waltz in and control everything without board approval. I've gone through legal counsel, I interrupted. Every transaction is lawful, and it's written in the company charter. Any shareholder with over 33% of voting power has unilateral veto rights. This is betrayal, Charlotte hissed. I looked her straight in the eye. No. This is justice. You mocked me for 10 years. Called me poor Ivy, the one who didn't belong. But every insult was a brick I used to build something none of you ever earned. A real foundation. Ethan tried to compose himself. So what? Now you want to be CEO? Take over everything? I shook my head slightly. I don't want power. I want Mrs. Eleanor's legacy protected. This estate won't be bulldozed for condos. It will become the headquarters of the Eleanor Foundation, a center for financial literacy and sustainable housing for single mothers and young entrepreneurs. I placed the final document on the table. Order of permanent suspension of Chandler Hillside assets sale. And as I watched Uncle Lawrence's stunned face, Charlotte's rage tightening her jaw, and Ethan's anxious headshake, I knew I'd done the right thing. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Each tick counting the seconds of shock my family was silently choking on. No one spoke. Ethan stared at the floor, fingers bone white around his glass. Charlotte hadn't even picked up her spilled orange juice. Uncle Lawrence stood frozen, eyes locked on the file Raymond had just placed on the table, as if by refusing to blink, he could somehow undo the truth. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. That silence said more than I ever could. For years, I was just an accessory in their perfect family portrait. Now, I owned the rights to that portrait. I opened the second folder. On top, the ownership certificate for River Point Heights, the luxury apartment complex where at least 4 people in this room currently lived. Or rather, rented from me without knowing it. So, I said, voice steady and clear. Maybe before we continue, we should talk a bit about River Point. Brad looked up, face flushed. What about River Point? You planning to buy that too? I smiled. For the first time, that meeting. No, I already bought it, almost 2 years ago. The air turned heavy with panic. Charlotte gasped. That penthouse I'm renting there belongs to W. Willow Holdings, I finished, a subsidiary of Chandler Legacy Trust, which I announced this morning. Ethan leaned forward. So, all the times we complained about rising utility fees, hallway maintenance, visitor parking, you were sending those complaints to me, I concluded, calmly. Brad braced himself against the table. And the 5% rent hike back in April? That was you too? I nodded. That increase was still 3% below market average. And if you'd actually read your lease, Clause 17, Section B, clearly outlines the right to adjust rates every 6 months. I turned to Charlotte, who was still stunned. And your penthouse? 1,450 square feet, southwest view, is being rented at over $1,200 under market. I'll have to revise that. Charlotte snapped. You can't. I can, I interrupted. And I will. Uncle Lawrence cleared his throat, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. Ivy, we're family. This isn't how we should be treating each other. I'm not attacking anyone, I said, eyes locking on his. I'm just laying out the facts. The same facts this room has avoided for over a decade. Raymond now activated a small projector in the living room, the same one once used to show Thanksgiving slideshows. A spreadsheet filled the wall, detailing my asset portfolio, every property, current valuation, return rates, and growth over the last 3 years. Charlotte stared at it and whispered, "How did you?" "Patience," I replied. "And not needing to flash luxury cars to prove I'm building something." Everyone stared at me like I'd drugged them into daylight after years in the shadows. I turned back to the main issue, Chandler Hillside. "Regarding the mansion," I said. "As a shareholder with 35% voting rights, I officially veto the sale. Furthermore, I propose converting the property into the headquarters of Eleanor Foundation, a nonprofit I've established to provide financial education, empower women's independence, and promote affordable housing in gentrifying areas." Ethan stood abruptly, voice sharp. "You're turning our legacy into a training center for strangers?" "No," I replied, holding his gaze. "I'm restoring the purpose Grandma Eleanor built this for, to create value, not to flaunt it." Brad scoffed. "Is this some kind of inspirational TED Talk?" I looked him straight in the eye. "No. It's a formal declaration of my position in this family. One you tried to erase for 15 years. And failed." Charlotte tried to rise, but her voice had lost all force. "You think this is over? You think money gets you obedience?" I exhaled slowly. "No, Charlotte. I don't want obedience. I want one thing clear. From now on, no decision involving the Chandler name moves forward without my consent." Raymond raised the stamped legal document. "Executed this morning at 8:15, legally binding, effective immediately." I stood there in that ornate room, once a symbol of hierarchy, sarcasm, and dinners where I was always placed closest to the door, and for the first time in my life, every eye was on me with caution. No more pity, no more ridicule. Only the quiet realization that I had become a force they could no longer ignore. And in that moment I heard Grandma Eleanor's voice in my mind. "Power isn't something you have to show off. It's when you walk into the room and people fall silent." Today, the room was silent. And I wasn't done speaking. The next morning, Chandler Hillside was no longer a place of smug glances or whispered mockery. No one dared call me poor Ivy anymore. At least, not out loud. The same people who used to laugh at my old car now avoided eye contact when passing me in the hallway. The air in that mansion had shifted. Not quite respectful but definitely cautious. And then, like a hastily written script after a power collapse, the shifts began. That afternoon Charlotte knocked on my door personally, holding a box of artisan chocolates and speaking in a voice so sweet it was barely recognizable. "Ivy, I reconsidered. You really surprised me. Maybe I was a bit harsh before. We should talk more, don't you think?" I took the box, nodded politely. "Thanks, but I'm off sugar. You should give them to Ethan. He could probably use a little sweetness right now." Charlotte flushed, forced a laugh, and retreated. 3 days later, Ethan invited me to lunch at an Italian restaurant downtown Portland. The same one that once refused my reservation when he submitted the guest list and forgot my name. "You know," he said, slicing into his lasagna and glancing up, "I think we could collaborate on a few big projects. I've got solid connections in the Pearl District. If you're looking into luxury condo investments, I can make introductions." I smiled, my voice remained calm. "I'm not looking for introductions. I'm looking for people of real value." Ethan's smile wilted. I left double the tip and stood up before dessert even hit the table. 2 weeks after that infamous meeting, I officially launched the Eleanor Foundation. Named after my grandmother. Just as I had promised myself. The Chandler Hillside mansion wasn't sold, and it wasn't turned into an empty monument to prestige. It became the headquarters for the foundation, hosting workshops on personal finance, investment guidance for single women, immigrants, and young people starting out with nothing. In the reading room where Grandma Eleanor once spent hours with me, now stood 3 desks and a large whiteboard. The kitchen was filled with the smell of hot chocolate and baked goods, replacing the cold silences that used to linger there. Some were surprised I didn't move into the mansion. I still lived in my rented second-floor walk-up in Rosewood. No elevator, overlooking golden maple trees in the fall. My car was still the Subaru Forester I changed the tires on myself last year. I still walked every morning. Still stopped by the same coffee shop where the owner remembered my almond milk ratio down to the spoon. I hadn't changed. The only difference was, they couldn't pretend not to see me anymore. Of all those who once looked down on me, only one came to see me without an agenda or an opportunistic gaze. Ava, my younger cousin by 6 years, the only one who once quietly slipped me a pair of dry shoes at that outdoor party when my feet were soaked. "I'm not surprised," Ava said when she visited the Eleanor Foundation on a rainy afternoon. "You've always been different. They just never let themselves see it." I invited her into Grandma's old office, still with the same leather chair and brass lamp. We sat down together, not as the poor girl and a Chandler descendant, but as 2 people who understood the weight of silence. "I want to help," Ava said. "Not because you have money, but because you have something this family lost." I nodded. "Then start with the library. I want to launch workshops on loan contracts and credit analysis." Ava smiled. "Leave it to me." I didn't forgive everything. I couldn't. Some scars don't fade just because money enters the picture. But I filtered. Those who returned with kindness, I welcomed. Those who returned just to sit closer to power, I kept at arm's length. My family had changed. Partly because they had to. Partly because for the first time they were seeing the person they'd tried to erase. I didn't need them to bow. I just needed them to remember. Everything they once took for granted could be taken back by the very person they had underestimated. I'm Ivy Wallace, 35 years old, a woman once labeled not one of us, who built an entirely new value system, not through noise, but through endurance. And this time, I'm not knocking on anyone's door, I'm the one holding the keys. Ivy Wallace's story is a powerful reminder that you don't have to be loud to make an impact. In real life, if you've ever been dismissed, judged by your appearance or background, remember this. True worth isn't measured by how others see you, but by how persistently you build your own path. No need for boasting. No need for instant validation. If you know you're headed in the right direction, the day will come when those who once looked down on you will have no choice but to step back and watch you rise. What do you think of Ivy's decision? Was she too strong, or was she simply claiming what she truly deserved? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to follow the channel for more powerful stories about family and life.